Hey there, Groovers. This is Tim from the Behavioral Grooves team with a hot tip for behavioral science enthusiasts. The BSPA, that's the Behavioral Science and Policy Association, is hosting a virtual conference on May 1st and 2nd, 2025. And Kurt and I have a special deal for you. As Behavioral Grooves listeners, you can save $25 off the cost of registration by using the code BSPA 2025. But hurry! This discount only works until May 1st when the conference begins. Head to behavioralpolicy.org and register with the code BSPA 2025. Do it now! This conference features top researchers and world-class practitioners that will share ideas that you can implement immediately in your work and your community. You'll hear from speakers including Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, former USAID chief economist Dean Carlin, and previous Behavioral Grooves guests, including Dave Nussbaum and Scott Young. If you're hearing this after May 1st, too bad, so sad. But BSPA hosts regular events, and we promise to keep you informed about all future events. For now, claim your $25 off the registration fees for this virtual conference using the code BSPA 2025. See you virtually at BSPA.
Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition and the daily decisions we make in our lives. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We use a behavioral science lens to understand what we can do to find and stay in our groove. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood, unavoidable, and undesirable aspects of what it's like to be human: conflict. But not just how to resolve it, but how to sit with it, grow with it, and maybe even come out stronger on the other side.
And we are thrilled to share our conversation with Joel Salinas and Bob Bordone, and we're going to discuss their groundbreaking book, Conflict Resilience: Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. Now, Joel is a neurologist whose research explores how our social relationships influence brain health, and his work helps us understand the underlying functions that make sitting with conflict so difficult and the ways our brains process that.
Now, Bob, on the other hand, brings decades of experience teaching negotiation and conflict resolution at Harvard Law School. His work applies the learnings of how we get through conflict. Together, they've created a powerful framework for handling conflict that goes beyond traditional resolution strategies.
Yeah, so in our conversation, we explore why the skill of sitting with the discomfort of disagreement is so essential in our increasingly divided world, whether it's at work or at home or in political discussions. They share insights on how our brains process conflict, why we develop reflexive behavioral patterns around these disagreements, and how we can rewire these responses for healthier and stronger relationships.
And don't let that subtitle fool you, by the way. This is not a book about old school conflict resolution. Joel and Bob introduce a more nuanced and frankly more practical framework for how we experience and handle disagreement. It's about developing a skill set and a mindset that they call conflict resilience.
Yeah, so whether you're navigating challenging conversations at work, struggling with reoccurring family conflicts, or simply interested in improving how you handle disagreement, this episode offers practical wisdom grounded in both neuroscience and real-world experience.
So let's dive into our conversation by sitting back with a full glass of conflict resilience and enjoy our conversation with Joel Salinas and Bob Bordone. Bob Bordone and Joel Salinas, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks
you.
for
Happy
having
to be
us.
here.
Yeah, we're excited.
We are glad to have you here, and we're going to start with a speed round. And I'm going to pose this one. Start with Bob. We're going to start with Bob on this one. Bob, would you prefer coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Excellent. And Joel, would you prefer to have dinner with your favorite musician or favorite athlete?
Ooh, favorite musician.
No, you just made a big fan of Tim. There you go. All right. So that's the first part. And actually, Joel, I'm going to ask you the same question that Tim Tim asked Bob, coffee or tea? Are you a coffee drinker or a tea drinker?
Coffee, 1000%. I actually do
1000%.
Wow.
I do 2 cups at all times. If one has caffeine, the other one is just water, so I stay hydrated. Yeah.
All right. We've asked that question to hundreds and hundreds of people. Nobody has given us that answer.
That's
So
a
there
great
you go.
answer.
That's funny.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, Bob, I'm gonna follow up with you. Would you prefer to live a year without your phone or a year without your computer?
Phone. Definitely phone.
Phone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Phone is the thing that felt like an innovation. Does not feel like an innovation.
Yeah. No, that's
Okay.
great.
Okay. Joel, a speed round question for you. True or false? It's really always best to go into a tough conversation with the purpose of showing someone that you're right and they're wrong.
False.
I'm sure we'll talk about that. All right.
I was doing the math in my head, and I was just like, no, I know the answer to this one.
There was a definite answer on that one.
Yeah.
All right, Bob, here is the last speed round question for you. Is it really possible to navigate disagreements with integrity and come out the other side with a healthier relationship?
Absolutely. Not only possible, but maybe necessary for a really great relationship.
Excellent. And we are going to definitely dive into that here, but just want to remind our listeners, we were talking with Bob and Joel about their book, Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. I love the "and giving in" part, by the way. That was particularly struck me. We need to start with a little bit of background, though. Both of you are at Harvard. Bob, you're a law professor. Joel, you're a neurologist. How did you come together on this book?
I mean, really divine fortune. No, no, more complicated. I mean, maybe a little bit more complicated than that. So, my work that I do, so I'm not really full-time at Harvard Law School anymore, but both when I was full-time and also now do a lot of work at Mass General because it turns out that, not surprisingly, conflict is everywhere, even in major research medical centers. And so I had the good fortune of just meeting lots of people with affiliations in medicine and research, and who also had Harvard affiliations. And one of those people was Joel, and we got to be friends, and at some point got to be colleagues. And now we get to sit on really cool podcasts with each other a lot.
That's great. It's always interesting, like when we talk to people and the connections and how they work and how that happens and all those different pieces. But let's get into the book. So let's talk about first off, just for our listeners, what is the definition of conflict resilience and how is it different, as we talked about pre-show, to conflict resolution? Right? What is conflict resilience?
I can start with the main definition, then Bob, you can go through the distinction.
Yeah.
So conflict resilience is a skill set and the mindset around our capacity to sit with the discomfort of disagreement.
I love that.
And how is it different? So it is really antecedent to or prerequisite to conflict resolution. So that is to say, if you can't sit with that discomfort of disagreement and listen well and speak your experience with authenticity, constructively, but also non-avoidantly, then you can't actually resolve a conflict, or at least you can't resolve that conflict short of vanquishing them in a fight.
Yeah.
Giving up or giving in, right? And
that's
in some
right.
instance, right?
Yeah. And so
oh, go ahead.
No. And so that's why the conflict resilience piece is so critically important first. And then we could talk about all sorts of kind of moves and things you might do when you're in it.
And if I understand from reading the book and in this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't mean that we actually ever have to always get to resolution, right? You can sometimes there isn't a resolution that comes in this. You're just able to sit in it, as you guys said, or the ability to genuinely sit and grow from that conflict, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is really to. I mean, there's and in any kind of conflict that you're entering into, one of the things we emphasize is really understanding what the purpose of that
Mm,
engagement is, because that'll help to clarify a lot for you in terms of how to approach, but especially whether you should approach as well. And as you go through it, as long as you're able to kind of remind yourself of the purpose behind it, that can also already begin to help you to give you a little bit of a boost to make it through that discomfort.
Joel, let me stay with you for a second.
Mhm.
Can you just expand on this and help give our listeners a feel for the context in which you're writing about, and that conflict resilience becomes an important factor?
Yeah, I mean, from the brain lens, I'm a neurologist. I'm also a research scientist. Done a lot of work in trying to understand how our social relationships influence our brain health.
mm,
And one of the things that was just really apparent in the literature was that social isolation and loneliness are things that not only are very deleterious to your health, it increases your risk of mortality and other really negative health things like heart attacks and strokes and things, some situations more than obesity and even smoking, but that is becoming much more common. And so this was one of the things that really got me thinking a lot about this, which is that it's just there's got to be some intervention, something that we can do to help to resolve this. And um, there's a lot that is working against us when we're trying to engage in that conflict because of our brain. So our brains evolved to be fortune-telling machines more than anything. Our brain is there to take experience from the past, create memories, and label all of those memories with positive and negative charges and things that you really need to pay attention to, and makes predictions all the time. Like we're constantly living in the past, present, and the future. It's like one of the really cool things about the brain. And as we encounter a situation where there's a potential conflict, we may perceive that as a physical threat to us. Like a lot of the same brain kind of wiring and programming around perceiving pain actually is the same kind of wiring and programming that can become active when you think that you're about to engage in a conflict or there's some potential disagreement that could be coming up. And the amount of kind of distress from that depends a lot on what your past experience has been. So for some of us, we've had really negative experiences with authority figures, or we've maybe gotten into a conflict with somebody who wore like a cowboy hat. And so from thence on, any potential conflict with someone in a cowboy hat has that additional charge. The brain works in kind of funny ways like that, but it's true that we have different situations and contexts where we have an easier time or a harder time. But to answer your question, like what is the context that we're in? It really is kind of what past experience have led up to that moment is. It's like we're bringing our baggage with us into this conflict situation. So we have to be really aware of it, so that way we can better begin to navigate it.
yeah.
Yeah, whether you're at work or at home, whether it's a personal relationship or a work relationship, in some ways that's almost immaterial to kind of the baggage that we're bringing into it, right?
Right, right, and I mean it's one of the if just thinking about like if there's like one thing you take from this book, from my perspective, it's an awareness. The more aware you are of your experience of conflict and how you have like what your tendencies or default reactions are to conflict, the better off you'll be. Awareness is more than half the battle. And we mentioned something called the 5 F's in the book. It's
Yeah.
like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fester. But basically, I mean, there can be many more F's to that. But the idea is, through our lives, we develop these behavioral loops that are very reflexive. In response to potential threats, and maybe at some point avoiding conflict, you know, really made that negative feeling feel less bad. And our brain coded that and said, okay, if I don't say anything, or if I leave the room, or if I ignore it, I'm going to feel less bad. So there's like a price tag to like a reward that
Yeah.
comes with it. And it makes it harder in the future to then kind of do something different, because you have all of these brain kind of mechanisms and pathways that are really honed in on repeating that behavior that is marked as like do this. There's a lot of reward behind this.
Yeah. So, Joel, you called it behavioral loops. We call them behavioral grooves, but it's the
There you
same
go.
thing.
There you go. It's true.
But so it's interesting. And one of the questions I had written down was this idea that you had brought up 5 Fs. And I'm very familiar with the 3 Fs, but I hadn't heard about fawn and what's
Fester.
Fester. So
Yeah.
Explain those two for our listeners, because I think most people are familiar with the, fight, flight, freeze piece of it.
Yeah. We brought in fawn because it's just another common reaction that people will report, which is really overly accommodating the other person or people pleasing, really kind of trying to almost kind of like gas the other side because it feels like, it feels like it diffuses the situation at the time, so it feels really good, but in the short term it doesn't really. I mean, it serves you in the short term but not in the long term.
Yeah.
And fester is essentially just like holding that and just like letting it fester, so building resentment or in the situation just not saying anything. And Bob can really speak to this with some of the clients that he's worked with, where they'll not say anything, and then like a year down the road they have like blow a hole at the side of their neck and have like a list of 100 grievances that they've never aired.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, Bob. Give us some examples of where these manifest themselves in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're kind of all over, right? I mean, so much of I think both the flight and the fester. I mean, there are variations on each other, but in the moment when we are, someone is coming at us, whether it's a family member or a colleague, and we run. We might be doing that in service of the relationship, or we're doing that to not upset them. But the festering, and this is, a lot of the first part of the book is influenced obviously by brain science, but also you can tell, and maybe some of your readers can tell, by internal family systems work.
Yeah.
Right. And the pieces work.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we leave, there's the side of ourselves that feels like, okay, we didn't upset them and that was good and was peaceful and that was good. But then there's a side of ourselves that's still like, yeah, but I had something to say there. Or, yeah, but like I still don't feel treated correctly in this relationship. And we're still in conflict. Like, it's just that it's just taking up our brain space, and it's taking up our dream space, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
So the notion that somehow you have dodged a bullet, all you've really done is disappointed a side of yourself that you are still stuck with and that you are going to contend with, right? That is festering. And so part of I think the invitation of the book is a reframe on conflict.
Mm.
Because conflict does create opportunities for connection, and connection both across the proverbial relationship or negotiation table, and also with your own self, which is probably a lot of the work that you do, right? The side of you that feels like it's important for me to raise this, and I'm worthy of this, and it's okay. And the side of you might be thinking, am I selfish for saying this? Or I'm not so sure. Those are both real, and they both deserve a voice, and they're both actually okay.
Yeah.
So piece one of just embracing those different sides instead of evaluating them, shutting them down, or, in the book we talk about something we call circus mirrors, which is that you remember going to, as a kid, you go to a circus, there's like those mirrors that make you look very long or very short or very wide, and they're distorting the reality. And I think a lot of us on our self conflicts have these circus mirrors. So how can I actually just depolarize that side of myself, saying that's just real, this is also real, how the other person is presenting is also real, and bringing all of that, including the ambivalence, into the room. That is a totally different kind of engagement that is more authentic, actually more life-giving, and is completely detached from resolution.
Yeah.
So the notion of hiding the conflicts or thinking we are just going to put it into a bento box just doesn't work.
All right. So two things from that. One, very first thing is, I think everybody from Minnesota, where we're Minnesota nice and we just avoid all conflict, I think should be reading this book right away. So there you go. Or mostly maybe even the Midwest. I know you guys are both East Coasters, but Midwest is very, very well known for the let's just like smooth things over. But Bob, you also said another piece in there, which was about this idea of like understanding yourself, and that and a lot of your book talks about that. It's not necessarily about us versus them or that, but it's the first part of this is understanding how you're showing up and what's going on with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think this is just to kind of double click on what Joel said earlier, right? The self-awareness piece. I think part of why this is so important, I spend and continue to teach negotiation and conflict classes to law students and executives. And I really believe that teaching skills is important. But the more I did the work, the more I realized that you can give people the right lines, but often they can't. And you could even put them in a simulation and they could do it, but they couldn't do it as themselves. Right. And that's where where I started to do some actually internal family systems work with some folks in Cambridge who had an affiliation at Harvard Law School, and just started to see that it is the work of knowing your own internal conflicts and ambivalences, and then being able in that moment to, when something is coming up, to say, oh, this is causing a conflict between two or three sides of me, that's going to make me want to run, or that's going to make me fawn, right? If you're a people pleaser, like, oh my gosh, I need to make them okay. And so, I mean, there's a CBT piece to this, right, as well. Like, oh, there's these 3 or 4 pieces. This is what's getting activated, but I have to remember that these other pieces are here. And my job in this moment is to make sure that all of them get some voice. And if I can't do that in this moment, that maybe I can do some taking a pause, right? This is where some of the brain stuff comes in, to kind of recollect myself, and then find another way to come back and represent all those sides. I mean, so part of what's also interesting to me around this, or that got me into this, was the role of lawyering. Because what you would see is people who could be very skillfully assertive, and I don't mean aggressive, but very skillfully assertive on behalf of somebody else, be completely non-self-agentic on behalf of themselves. And there's all sorts of reasons, right? Some of the things Joel talked about, like family of origin, gender, location, right? But it's all of this self-work. So the naming of the different pieces, and then the imagining that your work in the room is representative of the selves, can be, I think, very powerful and liberating. It's funny, I'll just say one really quick thing. I don't think I even told Joe. I know I didn't tell Joel this yet, because the email came last night. There's a very prominent person in the legal negotiation field. Her name is Carrie Menkel-Meadow. And she sent me a note last night, and she's like, oh, I'm really loving your book. It's a book about speaking up for yourself. And I thought, my initial reaction was like, it's really not about that. I mean,
it's a really interesting frame. Yeah.
But then I thought, like, maybe it is somewhat about that, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it's just like as people start to read the book, I guess both of us are going to have people say things like, your book is about something, and we're like, oh, it is.
Yeah. Well, and as you were talking through that, Bob, I felt exactly the same thing that I felt when I was reading it, about how your fundamental argument is that we can change, we can rewire, right? And so, Joel, I'd like to just talk, if you could, from the neurological side of this. We can actually sort of program the way that we think about ourselves when we come into these situations. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. There's this concept called neuroplasticity, which you may be familiar with, which just really is just how your brain changes and gets shaped by the environment around you, including the internal environment. But the idea is that our brain is constantly forming and breaking connections all the time. And so there is this malleability to essentially unlearning these past kind of behavioral grooves when it comes to conflict, and kind of create some new ones. And I think just for your listeners, viewers, who they are at the end of this episode will be very different than who they were at the beginning, and that
Mhm.
relates to this component of plasticity. Um, and it's not an easy. I mean, it happens all on its own, but to be able to have more agency or like self kind of efficacy, kind of like, or some sense of control with yourself around it, does take that awareness. And one of the things that can be really helpful, first, is that awareness, as we mentioned before, but then also approaching it almost like how you would approach lifting weights at the gym. So you don't go into the gym for the first time and start lifting the heaviest weights possible, right? You want to actually start with the lowest weight, do a few reps, get your form down right, and it's that practice of building the muscle strength, building the endurance, getting the form just right, that then lets you take on more load, and be able to do it well without getting hurt. And so there is some really interesting component to this that's a lot like exposure response prevention therapy, where you kind of want to get a sense of your level of distress using like subjective units of distress or SUDS about kind of different conflict situations that you're in. And if you think, if you can put a number from 0 being no distress at all, 10 being the worst distress imaginable, there's this kind of like 0 to like 3, 4 range that's probably a comfort zone. But where there's real opportunity for growth, this stretch zone is more in that kind of 4 to 6 range, but more than you're probably already at risk of straining. And so we want you to be aware and really engage these types of tools when you're in those stretch zone interactions.
Yeah. Bob, I think in the book, I think this was you, and correct me, maybe it might have been Joel, but there was a story you told about working with some high school students, and you had gone through and they were working, and then you got a knock on the door late at night because it's the first day of a multi-day thing, or maybe the second day, I don't remember exactly. Can you tell that story? Because it kind of, I think there's a part of it where it seems to a little bit align with what Joel is saying. Like they went right for the heaviest weights to go on, and it didn't
no,
work
it's
out
such
well.
such a moment, right? So this was, I was working with a group of high school students, actually, who had some pretty serious differences, like lines of difference on a bunch of issues. And it was a multi-day course. I think it was maybe the end of day 2. I can't remember, but it was like a 4-day course. I do remember that because we started 8 a.m. every day and ended at 5:30 every day. And anyway, we get this knock on the door, and we were like preparing. It's like late at night, we're exhausted, and they're like, "There's an emergency." Okay, like I'm not a medical professional. I don't know what I can do, but what had happened was a number of the young people who were just jazzed by the material, and particularly were jazzed by the listening piece that we had covered that day, decided, let's try it out. And to use Joel's analogy, they just said, let's bench press 250 pounds tonight. And they took the hardest issue, and it didn't go well, right? The conversation turned into a yelling match that was deeply affect the relationships pretty badly. I mean, people walked out, and we had to start the next day and continue in this course. And so, there was the touching piece of it was just that people really wanted to try it out. And I think the two other pieces, right, it was maybe too hard to go there that quickly. And also, and this is just, wherever you start, just giving yourself some grace in this. I mean, one of the things that I just see happen so often in my coaching practice is that people will, you'll do some preparation for whether it's a conversation with their boss or the conversation maybe with their parent about not driving anymore because they're getting older, and they'll come back to you and they'll be like, oh, it was a disaster. And with a little bit of like, I'm not going to do that again.
Right.
And you kind of sort of do some listening and you unpack it. And There are a bunch of moves they did that were great, and there are a bunch of moves that maybe they shouldn't have done. And also, this is hard. And one of the comforts of whatever mode you're doing, whether it's fighting or, the same conversation about the holidays all the time, it's both painful, but it has one big comfort, which is that it's predictable.
Mhm.
Actually, it's two big comforts. It's predictable, and if you have it every year and they're in it with you, they're still in it with you. And that's really nice. So the invitation to do something different imposes some risk. First of all, you won't be as skillful, but there's always that slight chance I would never say is not there, that maybe you'll learn something and they won't be in it with you anymore.
Yeah.
And yet at some level, if we want the connection and we want the authenticity, it might be worth doing that. And because if you get it, it's great. And if you don't, maybe that's the release, right? Because who wants to ultimately be in something with somebody who doesn't want to be in it?
Yeah.
But it's hard to get over that because the traditional fight does offer us something.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that, actually, that you guys explored some, I don't know, challenging things. Again, like we were talking earlier, Bob, how about when you started talking about things that I read, I had the same, I had that same visceral reaction, like, how can I change? How is that even possible? But you're effusive. The two of you are just effusive in your enthusiasm for believing that things can be better in this, and I just love that.
Yeah.
Don't
Can I
I
just say,
don't
I think for each of our
yeah.
professional backgrounds, like at some level, like as someone who teaches negotiation, the most depressing thing for me was someone who comes in and say, I have no power, there's nothing I could do.
Yeah.
Negotiation is an act of hope and possibility because it is about the belief to influence someone's choice. And if
Yeah.
you don't have that belief, then there is nothing you can do, right? So it starts there. And then the question is, where are you positioned and what are your skills and everything else comes into place. But the notion of it, to me, starts there. And I don't want to speak on behalf of Joel in a healing profession, but I feel like something similar must be there.
Well, yeah, from my perspective, I mean, there is a lot of enthusiasm for it because it's a bit like the parable of the wolves that you feed kind of inside, which is, no matter what you do, your brain will be responding to the environment around you and kind of learning and unlearning things in response to that. And the more you give yourself the control, right, to be able to shape that experience, the more you choose which wolf you feed, it's undeniable that change is happening, right? It's a biological process underneath the surface that you're not going to your DNA and causing it to transcribe. Uh, it's the whole process is happening always on its own.
Always, yeah. I want to loop back to just talk about sort of the big picture of the book. There's these three major sections, and we've bounced around a little bit through this through the first two, naming and exploring, and the third one is committing. But I really love this acknowledgement, this naming portion. So, like as I was reading through it, that really struck me as being super important until I got to commit, and it was like, oh, wait a minute, actually, that's most important.
Yeah.
But I want to get your opinion. What is the most precious baby among these
Uh,
for each of you?
I have a feeling Joel and I are going to say the same thing, but I'm not so sure. I would definitely say the name and dig
Oh,
deep. And the reason why I say that is I had a very strong personal commitment to not try to just write another book on conflict resolution and negotiation. And I hope all the parts rather, have some contribution. But the first part for me feels like most books that deal with difficult conversations um, don't go into all of the self work, which is part of the, the naming piece, the holding piece, and then all of the brain stuff. So for me, that's why we start there, and that part feels most special. Although, I like the other pieces. I actually will say the part that I feels least like original to me, maybe, is the kind of what do you say on listening, or what do you say on assertion? Although I think a lot of the work to get there, I think also feels new. But what do you like, Joel?
Yeah. I think there's two ways to answer that question, and you could think about it like what's most important, and then what's your favorite. And
fair enough.
And they can be this different from each other, and that's the case for me. So I think in terms of the most important step, I do think it's also the name step. And actually, I would even add a 0 step just before name, which is to pause and take a breath. And the name, but my favorite step of the 3 is the explore step, mostly because there's this kind of dance of the deep listening and the effective assertion that is just really important. I did improv comedy at one point, and one of these concepts of see and be seen really has stuck with me, which is the idea is you want to make sure that in the world around you that you are doing both, right? That you are paying attention to what's going on around you, really listening, seeing other people, acknowledging them, but also making sure that you are being seen, heard, and acknowledged. And I think to me, it just feels like what we need to have a society that can of people that can coexist with each other.
Yeah.
You're the first group no. I was saying you're the first people who asked us that question. And I love that you asked us that question for this reason. I had no idea that Joel was going to say that. And what I like about it, and now I'm putting more story on it that might be true. But in some sense,
but go ahead.
But in some sense, it feels like a validation, Joel, of our partnership. Mm-hmm. Because in some sense, I feel like I'm saying that the things that I learned from you feel the most exciting. And I'm not saying that you learned from me the listening and assertion, but that's the stuff that I do, that I've been doing, and the work. So I know, I just love that. Thank you for asking that question.
Hey Groovers, we want to take a moment away from our conversation to thank you for listening to Behavioral Grooves. If you enjoy the conversations we're having and want to help us keep the groove going, here are a few simple ways that you can support the show.
First off, subscribing to our Substack is a great way to stay connected with us between episodes. The weekly newsletter provides you with cool insights that are beyond the episodes, and they get delivered straight to your inbox.
And if you haven't already, leaving a review or a rating of the podcast on a platform like Apple or Spotify or YouTube helps other curious minds discover us. And there's 2 great things about that. 1, it gives us a boost, and 2, it costs nothing.
And it only takes a second, but it makes a huge difference for us. Plus, we love hearing from you, so don't be shy. Leave us a review or give us a quick thumbs up.
We're coming up on 500 episodes, and we're doing this because we love the conversations we have with our guests.
Yeah, we also want to do it because we love bringing you insightful, behavior-changing content every week, and we hope that some of those insights will help you find your groove.
Oh, yeah. Good. Well, great. Actually, I want to dig down because Joel, you started talking about deep listening, and it was one of the favorite concepts that I had. I mean, we've gone through, Bob, as you said, you read a bunch of books, and it's about listening and different things. But I love this, and I'm going to quote. And you said, "Deep listening is only genuine when we are truly open to the possibility that our viewpoint, perspective, or story isn't necessarily wholly correct, 100% true, or completely right. Or at the very least, that our view may not be the only legitimate way of seeing a situation." So, which feels really hard, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, is that what you guys find in this work? And then what do we do? So how can we listen if we have to, I have this belief and I'm not going to let go of that belief. How do we go through that?
I can speak to the neuroscience around that, and Bobby can bring in the more tactical. But I think from the neuroscience side, there has been some work looking at kind of brain systems that are involved based off of what they call sacred beliefs. You may have heard of this concept, but these sacred beliefs, these are kind of beliefs that tend to be associated with brain activity that is a little bit more limbic or paralimbic. So this is like amygdala and like hippocampus. It's more like salient systems. And once these sacred beliefs tend to soften, when you feel that there can be another possibility, that's when you start to actually see more activity in these frontal parietal networks that are much more involved in deliberative thinking and strategic thinking, and it's for judgment, planning, organization. But these are it's really helpful to be able to shift from one kind of set of networks to the next one, just because that just increases your ability to come up with a new solution or a new way forward that you didn't have before. And it's really powerful, and you especially feel very stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bob, you want to
Yeah, do you
add
wanna
on
jump
to
in on
that?
that, Bob?
Look, I think you've picked the like hardest thing. I love so glad
Of course I
glad
did.
that you did this, because this is the objection: is I'm not curious, and I
Yeah.
am right.
Yeah.
And you could say whether it's on a controversial thing like climate change or immigration or the Earth is flat, right? If someone is saying the Earth is flat,
Yeah.
I'm not curious, and I am right. So how am I going to do this? I think the answer to that, I think there is an answer, but it's a hard one. You have to find something in that you are genuinely curious about. It might not be their scientific explanation of why the Earth is flat. Maybe it's how they came to see it that way.
Mm.
Maybe I'm curious about what they think about people who think the Earth is round. What do you think of those people? But if I can't find something that I'm curious about that I'm not sure about, it's going to be hard to make this work, because you're going to, even if you do the behaviors, you will look rehearsed, and that will fall flat. People can detect that really fast.
Yeah.
Um,
I think we refer to that as the bullshit meter. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah.
You know, Joel, you brought up earlier this idea about sort of a cultural level of
Mhm.
conflict resilience,
Mhm.
and the two of you are advocates for this idea in a business setting of actually having business leaders sort of breed a culture of conflict resilience. Can you talk a little bit about that, Joel? I'd like to get sort of the neuroscience perspective first, if you don't mind, and why that. First of all, is it possible, and how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, it is definitely possible, and part of that has to do. I mean, we're social creatures, and just we naturally learn from each other by example. There's all sorts of mirroring systems in our brain that are kind of simulating what you see around you all the time, whether or not you're aware of it, and so we are prone to kind of take on the habits and behaviors of the people around us. This is why kind of emulating kind of behaviors can be really important, but you can be even more effective at it when you do encounter situations where there's like a disagreement or conflict, really using it as a teachable moment potentially, with especially if you have like mentees or you have a team, and just kind of say like, what went well and what could be done differently. And the more open you are about both the what went well and what to do differently, and very specific about it, the more likely people are able to see like, oh yeah, there's something there. And just drawing attention to it, that alone is already doing quite a bit, because that's increasing the level of awareness around it, which then gives people an opportunity, that space, to then engage with kind of how to better navigate the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, Bob, what are your thoughts about that? This building this culture, this very intentional cultural advance that leadership could take. How should they go about it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think so much is around modeling, and I don't know if you guys have looked at Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety.
Oh yeah.
I think there's a lot to be drawn from there about how does the person who is the leader model vulnerability. How do they show an environment where the different viewpoints are actually encouraged, right? So we are very careful not to use the word safe space, because we think that is a promise one can't keep when there are people with feelings and histories and emotions and stories. But you can do things to lower the risk and increase the opportunity space of how do you share different views? How do you disagree? And, there's all of this, research that shows that the failure to do that leads to really bad decision making. I mean, we tell this a little bit of the story of Boeing, right? Because Boeing is not an example of bad engineering.
Right.
It's not. The Space Shuttle Challenger, which is, in my multi-party negotiation class, I use a simulation that's called Carter Racing that is based on Challenger. In fact, it uses the same exact data. They had all of the data 100% of the time in the testing when they launched this under, I believe it was 35 degrees. The O-ring on the Challenger shrunk.
Yeah.
100%, not 50, 100%. But if you don't create that environment, and if people feel like they can't speak, I mean, those are scientific things, but whether it's just how I think about who would buy this product or what's attractive, then you're just going to make crummy decisions. And it's not going to be a great place to work. And so then you have some HR firm spending a lot of money to bring in all sorts of diverse people. And then they spend a lot of money to have affinity groups. By the way, I support affinity groups because people need to be in places where they feel comfortable and where they feel like they can let their hair down a little bit. But if that's all you're doing and you're not doing the work to make the organization conflict resilient, you're spending a lot of money and you're not getting much benefit.
Yeah. You use a term in the book that I really loved as an analogy. It's this idea of creating greenhouses for conflict resilience, and I love that because you bring up you can't grow the stuff in the middle of a winter unless you have this other piece. And so, Bob, I think what you're saying right there is like you can you can plant all you want in doing all these different things, but if you don't have that environment where they can actually grow and do this work, or having this idea of conflict resilience, then it's a waste of effort, right? You're not going to grow that tomato. You're not going to get that plant. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny, like the trajectory of my teaching at Harvard Law School, I started teaching negotiation. And then the clinic I actually founded was called the Dispute Systems Design Clinic. And it was more, how does an organization hardwire a set of systems or processes for handling differences? And that was really born of me seeing, it's great to have individual skills, but if the organization doesn't have any processes in place, or if they don't make any sense, or if they're not coordinated, then no one's going to do anything, right?
Yeah.
The conflict resilience experience kind of comes after that. You could have a good system, you could have some good skills, but if the individual person also doesn't feel like they want to be uncomfortable or sit with the discomfort, then no one's going to do anything either. So, I mean, there's a way in which all this can be overwhelming. And obviously, I spend a lot of my time and energy thinking about this, but it's how do we be diagnostic? Because lots of organizations are not that diagnostic.
Yeah.
They're like, we need a mediator, or this is a lawsuit, or come teach us a negotiation class. And it's all kind of connected in a way. And what I just kind of, again, really loved about, working with Joel on this is it's also like going on in our brains, right? At a evolutionary level. And I think the other thing that I loved about the experience, just as a not a brain scientist, did we talk about neuroplasticity a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
The fact that you actually have some ability to change that. Because I think that pre my working with Joel, I would have been like, it's great that like you have the brain, but like you can't do anything about it. So it's like good book knowledge, right? It's like good book knowledge, but whatever, and that's just not true.
Yeah. Earlier we did touch on this idea, and you were bringing this up, Bob, that a lot of this conflict is within ourselves. And in the book, you tell a great story about Dolly Parton and Porter Wagner. And Dolly's a a portion of her career where she's really kind of coming forward, right? Porter Wagner was a monster in the country music industry, and he's bringing her forward, and she's getting a lot of publicity and support that she'd never had before, and yet there was this inner conflict, for her. It was challenging, and I was wondering, could one of you just talk through that story and how she dealt with and how she built up this conflict resilience in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I really love that story. I first heard it in Dolly Parton's America, which is a great podcast. It really stood out for me. There's this. Imagine your career is really taking off when you're kind of linked to somebody. You're kind of a little bit under their shadow, but you kind of don't mind it at first because it's really helping to elevate you, giving you a lot of experiences. But then you're beginning to notice that you feel like you're kind of stuck.
Kurt feels that way all the time with me.
Well, do I have advice for you?
Okay. I'm listening very intently here.
I hope you're a great songwriter. Well, I just really loved that where she just had a moment where she just realized where she needed to part ways. And she describes, like, at least like in this interview, she talked about how she went back and forth, right? They just kept on having the same argument over and over and over again, and it really wasn't getting anywhere. And she felt that, for the big purpose that she had, which was to help to advance her career and just make really amazing music, it didn't make sense for her to continue to be in that partnership. And so she did the really hard step of effectively asserting her perspective, which she did in a song, right? It says the "I Will Always Love You" song. I mean, I always get goosebumps just thinking about just like her singing this song in the trailer, and of just like as a part of just like this ending of this partnership, because it's acknowledging, it's honoring the partnership that you have, but also in a really full-throated way, still sticking to the point that I need to go.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, right? There's so much both and in this, because it doesn't end with a bow. She does go professionally. She still finds a way to stay kind of connected and supportive, and it's not comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she had to sit with that and live with that and be okay with that, which is, I think, again, encapsulates a lot of what you guys are talking about here.
I just have to ask, have either of you been to Nashville, to RCAA Studio B, where that song was recorded?
No,
yeah, but
of course Tim would know exactly which studio it was in. That's
Highly recommend going and experiencing, sitting in the place where she was singing and Porter Wagner was sitting in the control room when she was recording it, and it's kind
Can
of
a regular person like us go?
I think so. I think you can book. There's some studio tour things. I think so. Yeah. Okay, but
right.
Enough of my personal dream for you guys. So if you were to be stuck on a desert island, this is for both of you, by the way. You're stuck on a desert island for a short period of time, and with you is an device that can only play 2 musical artists' catalogs. You can only bring 2 with you. Oof. Which 2 are you going to take? And so, Bob, you look the most flummoxed, so I'm going to point to you. You go first.
I think our book says I'm supposed to pause. And breathe. What does the book say?
Let's name it.
I know one of them right away is Ed Sheeran. I'm a big Ed Sheeran. So that one is easy. Gosh. The other one is, much more challenging. Now, any credibility I got with any of your listeners to go out the door right away. But I'll just be honest. I love Kelly Clarkson. I'm bringing her.
There you go.
So
that's great.
That's not there. You're not losing any credibility. Yeah.
What a terrific voice. Holy smokes. Yeah, absolutely. Joel?
But my number 1 would be Lady Gaga.
Okay.
Nice.
And then my number 2, that's a really hard one. I agree. I've got like a close tie between 3 options, so I'm just gonna say the 3.
Are you cheating on this? Are you cheating?
Don't
No,
let him do that.
I'll tell you my nominees, and I'll tell you who I select.
Oh, and then the winner. I like this. I like
Right.
this. And
So
the runner-up is okay.
It's
Okay.
between Whitney Houston, Billie Eilish, and Philip Glass.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
And I would probably choose. I would choose Philip Glass mostly so that way I have the balance of high and low energy.
Yeah.
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 That's
We have lots
interesting.
of people who, when we ask this question, Tim asks this question all the time, and there is this diversity, right? It's like, oh, I have to have that upbeat kind of thing, but then I need something to just kind of go. And so having that novelty of not having two artists that are very similar in their musical styles. But yeah, those are great.
Joel, Bob, thank you very much for being guests on Behavioral Grooves today.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having
This
us.
was a lot
This
of
was
fun.
fun.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Joel and Bob, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our conflict-resilient brains.
Bing. Resilience. I like the resilience thing. Like, okay, so much about it's so why focus so much on resolution when we could focus on just like building up our own. It's like the antibody discussion that we had several years ago. I think it was during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Sort of inoculating your psychology against troubles in the world and the way that you experience things. I think resilience is a great way to go.
I loved how they talked about sitting in it. And there's that language of being able to sit in the discomfort that conflict has. You and I are both conflict avoiders.
Very, actually, I'd say that we're in the professional level of conflict avoiders.
We are the goats of conflict avoiders, right? We are the greatest of all time in that. And I think there is something for us to learn in particular about how we can sit with that uncomfortableness.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, there were three pretty main topics that I thought I just wanted to quickly recap here before we get into our discussion. And the first one was negotiation is about hope. Just love that Bob really brought that to the forefront, because I think sometimes we think, oh, have to negotiate something, it's going to be terrible. But he said negotiation is about an act of hope and possibility, because it is about the belief to influence someone's choice.
Ah, that is so cool. I do. That's great. So for me, I think, and I think I mentioned this in the episode, is the 5 Fs. I did not know.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to understand that there are more than just fight, flight, and freeze, which were the 3 that I knew. I mean, even the freeze part has been relatively new in my vocabulary. It's always it's we either fight or flight in response to this, right? And then it was like, no, you can freeze too. But the addition of fawn and fester, fawning, that overly accommodating or people-pleasing thing, which, and I think about it, what do we do oftentimes when fawning is for me, right? And then festering,
great. Love it.
holding on to those resentments, that not addressing the conflict, just being kind of Midwestern in our response, and like not saying anything to their face, but just talking about them afterwards at the water cooler, right? It's a total Minnesota nice kind of thing to do. There you go.
Okay. The third thing that I wanted to mention was the self-awareness is the key. That when Bob said self-awareness is the work of knowing your own internal conflicts and ambivalences, and then being able to, in that moment when something is coming up, say, oh, this is causing a conflict between 2 or 3 sides of me. Like that. That's a hard moment to be in. And I think it's a hard moment to approach. So I wanted to see if you and I could spend a few minutes talking about why self-awareness is so important in this.
It's vital. And this comes not just in this episode, but in multitudes of the episodes that we do, Tim.
Yeah.
The idea of self-awareness, this of removing the rose-colored glasses from looking at our own thoughts, behaviors, feelings, all of those I think are really good. And I think it was really interesting, and I wanted to get your take on this, is this Joel mentioned in the interview that awareness is more than half the battle, which is directly different than kind of the Laurie Santos G.I. Joe fallacy, which is the knowing isn't even half the battle when it comes to behavior change. So
So, yeah,
how do we reconcile these two? How do we not have them be in conflict here, Tim? Can we just sit with the conflict, or do we have to resolve this conflict? That's what I want to know.
let's be resilient, Kurt. Let's be conflict resilient. I actually saw awareness is more than half the battle from Joel as a symbol or a sign of literally awareness, not actually knowing, but simply being present to it. So I think of awareness as being something like I'm I'm aware of my surroundings. Now, I don't know everything about my surroundings, but I'm aware of them. I have some consideration of them, but I don't know about it. And so I think that there's less conflict between the Laurie Santos G.I. Joe fallacy comment about knowing isn't even half the battle, because she's talking about this illusion of, well, because I have this information, then I know that, and that ameliorates everything. I can take care of everything. But when Joel says awareness is more than half the battle, I think that he's just talking about being present. That's how I took it.
I took it as self-awareness, to your point, right? This idea that
Yes.
I am aware that I am feeling this conflict and I'm not just brushing over it, that I am aware of the conflict that I'm feeling, the angst that I'm feeling. And
Mm-hmm.
that is different than knowing. Knowing is I know when I'm in a conflict moment that I should be responding with resilience. But if I'm not aware, that's the big piece. So I
Yeah.
agree with you. I don't think there is as much kind of that butting of heads within these two kind of pieces.
So
It's a very different focus on awareness, particularly if it's self-awareness versus this knowing the fact, knowing what I should do, as opposed to being aware that I'm in this situation where now I can apply the knowing that I
yeah.
do.
Yeah. So that awareness could just start with the 5 F's. Awareness that I'm feeling that desire to flee, for flight, for freezing, for fawning, for festering, for just to be
You,
aware of those kinds of things isn't knowing what I'm going to do. But I think that there is some comfort in starting with the awareness of, oh, my first tendency is to go here, right?
yeah. Did you notice, and maybe I missed it, but I think you totally skipped over fighting. You went right to
Oh,
flight, to freeze, to
I,
fawn, to fester, with totally skipping over the fight part. Again,
boy,
maybe that's a
that's a
yeah,
Freudian dress right there.
Freudian slip. There you go. Yeah, that's crazy. But with that, I think that is a really important piece. And so for people be to have self-awareness, one of the things is we go through our lives too often, I think, very quickly, without
Mhm.
pausing, without taking a moment, as we've talked about before, of taking a breath or two and sitting and trying to understand, what am I feeling, as opposed to just continuing going down this conversation, or continuing with the behaviors that I have without a stop, reflect, and then move forward.
Yeah, this is that space between the stimulus and the response, right? It's
Oh, Viktor Frankl, way to go,
gonna
Tim.
gonna go there. Absolutely. It's in that space, right? That Frankel suggests that we get to choose, right? This is
Yeah.
where our agency comes into play. We get to choose. So it's a powerful space. But getting back to this first point, it's predicated on awareness of what it is that is actually that we're actually feeling.
Yeah.
I think Joel also said this kind of wonderful thing about you kind of have to choose which wolf to feed.
Mm,
So
yeah.
in that space, if you become aware, then you can say, I'm not going to feed fawning or fighting or freezing. I'm not going to feed those. I'm going to go somewhere else. And those decision points, those little inflection points that we have, those are important to respond to.
Well, and I think it's important because our brains have plasticity, right? And so we can shift our automatic responses. There is this element of learning and unlearning. It's the freeze, unfreeze, refreeze
Yep.
component,
Yep.
of a Kurt Lewin. So this idea of being able to feed the wolf, right, is part of that building the response that you want because you're rewiring your brain.
Yeah. Well, let's go there. Let's talk about the rewiring of the brain because I think the second key aspect of a self-awareness is being able to break neurological patterns. Because if we rely on this idea that what fires together wires together, let's put the wiring together intentionally for what we want it to be. Right. Let's be aware of those 5 F's of how we're feeling about something, and then choose the wiring, at least at first, with some intentionality until it becomes, through neuroplasticity, a regular thing, becomes the norm. It becomes how our natural instinctual behavior becomes.
Right. So just take conflict in it's kind of use a made up kind of thing. So conflict presents itself and my immediate response is to flee, to I don't avoid it, to
Okay.
just ignore it. And that gives me an immediate little dopamine release because
Uh huh.
I've just avoided this. So that's it's a reward that gets rewired again. However,
Hmm.
it doesn't take into account that now I'm going to be uh, facing that same conflict at a later time, maybe enlarged, gotten a lot
Right.
bigger, or that I will fester over this, or I will ruminate over it over and over and over again, and that will have a negative consequence. But immediately, that pairing, I got a little dopamine fix, and that then reinforces that moving forward. So if we can have self awareness come in and stop that moment of I'm going to ignore this or flee from this and face it, doesn't get that necessarily dopamine immediate, but it does then translate into something longer. And you can rewire around that by keeping doing that. So,
So having better relationships at work or at home, or living a better, happier life through this conflict resilience, maybe even finding your groove, might require some level of programming, right? Maybe a new mindset, but that's going to happen. It's going to start on a neurological basis, I think.
yeah. And I love that Joel used the weight training at the gym
Oh yeah, yeah.
example and is saying, look, don't go out and try to lift 300 pounds if you've never bench pressed before.
Right,
Right.
right.
Same thing on these. Take little incremental steps, right? As what did he call it? Subjective units of distress. Is
Yeah,
that I think the
right.
words? I mean,
Yeah, right.
only a neurologist would talk that way, right? But this
Uh-huh.
is, we're building that capacity, gradually building that capacity to sit with the angst of the change, of
Yeah.
the conflict. And that was another piece actually I just kind of did it here is that this idea is that this is about conflict, but I think there's a power in just thinking about sitting with the unease, the angst that you have in a number of situations, and being resilient around it as opposed to trying to resolve it. Change, organizational change that companies are going through, and the stress that causes us, the components of any other type of element where you're going, this isn't really where I want to be. And just the ability to be in that moment and not try to run away from it or avoid it, I think is big.
Yeah. Can you talk about that for just another minute, Kurt? Because what I hear, I know that you've worked on with a big multinational client recently on a big reorg, and and there's a lot of stress involved in that for
Well, there's a
a
yeah.
lot of people. Can you just spend a minute on sort of the way that you addressed, dealing with with those stressors?
Well, and I wish we would have had this conversation because I might have actually included some of this resilience piece. We talked about resilience. I actually, as part of that component, I did talk about the resilience around stress. And, there's lots of good pieces there. But with that, it was, an organizational change, significant change. And because of that, people were feeling the anxiety of, will I have a job? Will I not have a job? Will my job
Right.
be the same? Will I enjoy it as much, or will it be more stressful? Will it change so much that I don't even like coming into work? And
Right.
we had to work with the leadership team, but also then all the way down to the employees on teaching them some skill sets. And so we taught them things around, how do you make decisions under uncertainty? How do you actually have emotional resilience
Nice.
in the face of change that you don't control? How do you communicate with people in these types of situations? So there was a whole process that we went through, and the organization, we taught them these skill sets, and we had them practice some of these skill sets. And again, it's different than what we're talking about here, but I really would have, in retrospect, if we could have had people learn how to sit with the uncomfortableness of some of this and saying, that's okay. I don't have to solve it right now or flee from it. I can just be in the moment. I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of value in that.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. The third part of self-awareness, I think that we wanted to talk about is more about understanding our own internal conflicts, right? Sort of the
What?
psycho.
I have no internal conflicts.
I know you're always perfectly aligned in everything that you think and do.
Oh my God.
what
Yeah.
what is it that common sense does not necessarily mean common practice? But
Knowing isn't half the battle. There you
knowing
go.
is not half the battle, no. But awareness is. And so Bob emphasized that we often experience this conflict within ourselves before we even engage with others. Like there's this
Yeah.
predisposition that we're going to have to, fight, flight, flee, flicker, float, floop, do all those F's. And when before we even get to that situation, we've kind of already made up our mind, even though we haven't thought about it consciously. And so if we start to pay attention and be aware through this self-awareness, then we can do something about it, right? Then we can start to have a plan of action and go, I know this situation's coming.
Well,
You had all these employees know this big move is going to happen. So how can we prepare for it?
it's
Not
that
just as an
internal, right?
organization, but as individuals.
Yeah. So it's the competing voices in our head that can
Yeah.
happen prior to even any of this happening, right? So
Yes.
one part of us wants to speak up against the man, right? But the other wants to, keep peace and make sure I have a job and not be
Right.
the rebel rouser, because
Mhm.
that gets you in your hand slapped, right? And then another one might be like, the other voice is like, well, you're just being selfish in here, and you need to be, give up your stuff for the good. And there is this inherent conflict between those voices. And
Mhm.
which voice, this goes back to the wolf piece that we talked about, which wolf do you feed? And that's the one that comes out stronger. And is that the right voice to feed? Is that the right wolf that you are
Yeah.
looking to do?
Well, and from all of this, where is my authentic self in all of this? Where's my core self? Where's my core being? Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
We
I
don't
know.
need that true self. What are you talking about? Come on. We can just be a fake plastic, mannequin.
If you're going to find your groove, you're going to have some alignment with your true self, your core self, your authentic self. And that self-awareness is critical, I think, in leading us into who that authentic self is.
All right. Okay. I think we've covered most of the points there, Mr. Houlihan. Any
Uh,
others?
um, no, I just really enjoyed the conversation with Joel and Bob. They're
Yeah.
smart guys, and I really always appreciate talking with smart people. I also want to say thank you to listeners who have left ratings and reviews recently. We
Yeah.
really appreciate that. We always appreciate just getting a nice word, but getting back to this whole leave a rating or a review actually contributes to the algorithm that the podcast suppliers use to promote us to other to non-listeners. So
So
makes a
what's really
difference.
interesting, Tim, is there might be conflict between our listeners on Podbean and on Spotify and on Apple, right? As like which group is giving us the most comments and ratings?
It's a battle to the death.
It is. There's conflict there, man. It's like, we're going to beat these guys. We're going to beat those Spotify folks. And Spotify's going, no, we're beating those damn Apple people. And the Podbean are just going, hey, people, let's all get along. We can all enjoy this, right?
And what about the YouTubers? What about
the YouTube?
people watching
Those
video?
YouTubers. Oh, those
Bloody
YouTubers.
hell.
Yeah, man. They're coming. They're small, but coming on strong, man. They are taking the Behavior Grooves mantle and grooving it up, baby. That's what I have to say. Oh my God, where the hell did that come from?
I don't know.
But anyway, we appreciate everybody listening. And with that, Groovers, we hope you take a bit of our conversation about sitting with conflict and being okay with it and take that to make this week one that you can go out and find your groove.